Hello, my name is Maximilian Girardin. I'm here with Lily Margolis, and we're doing a little bit of flight school, learning about spirits and differences between them.
The first question I have is let's define exactly what a spirit is.
Sure.
Because when I was in college, I was buying liqueurs thinking they were the exact same thing, and I just realized they were different a few weeks ago.
So the difference between liquor and liqueur, other than just spelling, is that liqueur has a pretty high concentration of sugar. They are all generally spirit-based when it's liqueur, and we'll talk a little more about spirit-based, but the fundamental difference is that they're lower in alcohol and higher in sugar. A spirit in itself is something that is a distillate of something that has been fermented. So you take something and you ferment it and you get out your alcohol, and then you chuck it into a specialized kind of almost an oven called a still. You evaporate off all of your ethanol and you condense it back down into a more focused form, and that's the act of distillation. When you distill, you get a spirit out of it because back in the day, they thought it was the spirit of whatever grain or the spirit of the grape that they were doing. And so it was just kind of an old-timey way to refer to it, and the name has survived till now. What we're starting out with here is the vodka. And vodka is one of those tricky categories where you can make a vodka out of anything fermented. So
I thought you could only make vodka out of potatoes.
And that's a really common misconception. Anything that has sugar in it at all that you can ferment and make alcoholic, you can then distill into vodka. Vodka is actually one of the only categories of spirit where the base, where you're getting your alcohol from, does not define what the product is. So you can have a vodka made from rice or grapes, or in Spirit Hound's case, I believe it's a mixture of corn and barley, but it might just be 100% corn. So what a vodka is fundamentally is a spirit that has been distilled all the way up until it is at a neutral proof. And this is a legal definition that changed, more than 10 years ago, I think 15, 20 years ago. It used to be called something that was odorless or tasteless. But as a designation, that was actually really tricky to legally define because taste is very subjective from person to person. And what one person may say, this doesn't taste like anything, another person might say, well, it tastes like corn or rubbing alcohol or whatever else. So vodka, as a legal definition now, is something that's distilled to 95% alcohol by volume at least, which is at neutral. It doesn't have very much character from there. And then it's watered back down for drinkability because most people don't drink something at 95.
Okay, I didn't think it was 95%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a little bit about tasting and smelling spirits. A lot of people will be swirling their glasses and things like that. What you're actually doing when you do this is much more important for spirits than it is for wine, because when you swirl, you're agitating everything that's in there. You ever stick your nose in a bottle and you wrinkle your nose up and you're like, wow, that's really like strong alcohol. Yeah, those are all of those volatile molecules popping up into your nose and telling you, ooh, this is strong alcohol. When you swirl it, you actually tend to knock those out of the thing, out of your glass, whatever you're drinking from, and you let all of the aromas stay inside. Another habit you'll see spirits drinkers using instead of what wine people do. When wine people are drinking, they swirl from the stem. That's because they're trying to not warm up their wine. Ideally, their wine is served at the correct temperature. When you're drinking spirit, you tend to see, at least those of us who drink a lot, are warming it up as we go because we're trying to get more of the aromas from it while we agitate. After you've warmed it up a little bit and given it a smell, same kind of smells that you would do when you're doing a wine tasting, you open your mouth a little bit as you inhale in order to get more of the aromas. You should be noticing all of the higher notes, all of the lower notes. And is there anything off the cuff that this smells like to you at first?
Vodka.
Smells like vodka? Yeah.
And I mean, I also don't smell vodka a lot, so when I feel like, for me, vodka in itself is its own scent.
Sure.
And because when I smell it, I'm smelling just so much of a high concentration of alcohol, it's really hard for me to focus on anything else because it's so intense and it does make me like
Right.
wrinkle my nose.
So what you're picking up on is that, like I said, vodka is 95% ethanol. That remaining 5%, that's where all of our flavor and taste and all of that come from the spirit. And then also the water that they use has a huge impact, because about 50% of what's in your bottle as an end product is the water. So you'll see very, very fancy brands of vodka sourcing water from very interesting places, or a lot of local distillers have, like Spirit Hound has access to really incredible quality water from the Rockies here. So it's always kind of the quality of the water is a big part of the quality.
So if I'm trying to buy a good vodka, I should pay attention to where the water is coming from too.
Yes, but also that might be partly marketing. Water is water for the most part, but you will find that if it's really, really good water, you have a much cleaner kind of sense of the vodka and of the grain involved.
Okay.
On the nose, for me, what I get is there's a little overtone of sweetness, but with vodka, remember, it's always going to be very subtle. And then on the palate, you'll find that I tend to taste front of palate, mid palate, back palate, and swallow, right? And we call this swallow the finish. And a good spirit will have all of those categories. It'll have aroma, it'll have the front, middle, and back, and finish. And what that'll tell you about the spirit is how well it's made, especially on the finish. You ever have a shot of something and you go, oh, I'm still tasting that, right? So after you go through all of those, tell me what you get on the front of the palate on this one. It's not a test. There's no wrong answers. Taste is subjective.
Okay, I thought it was just gonna be like, oh, it tastes like vodka. But I taste other stuff too. It tastes like richer in a different way than I thought it would. And I, like, what I would normally expect from a vodka, like feeling my mouth just kind of like burn from the alcohol. I feel that more like under the tip of my tongue than just like all over my mouth. Like it feels like smoother, it feels richer. Maybe I've been drinking really bad vodka in college.
It's very possible. So one of the words that you said there, smooth.
Yeah.
This is a word I hear all of the time when people are asking me, what's the best whiskey? What's the smoothest whiskey? What's the smoothest vodka? Is it smooth? Smooth is one of those words for the description of spirits that's actually just pretty inadequate. And there's nothing wrong with having said it, because we know what you're saying. When you say, I want something smooth, what you're actually saying is, I want something that doesn't taste like cheap alcohol, that burns me on the way down, that hurts. It can be very, very strong stuff, but if it's made really well, you'll find that it drinks smooth. So descriptors that I try to encourage people to come up with rather than using smooth is much more about texture and texture quality, because spirits are a very textural experience.
Silky or like round.
Exactly. And this is both silky and round. It's also got a little sweetness on the front of the palate, and it finishes very cleanly. There's not a lot of lingering anything there. It's got a very almost like water on the finish, but a little more texture to it. Yeah. All right, let's try the gin.
Okay.
All right, so gin. What is gin anyways?
I know it has juniper.
Yeah, nailed it.
Okay.
Yeah, so gin essentially, and I'll probably get in trouble for reducing it in this way, but gin is essentially just a flavored vodka. There's a lot of different styles of gin out there now where they're playing around with that, and flavored vodka is not a correct definition for it. But what I mean by that is that they're taking a spirit that is neutral, just like the vodka we tried at its base, and then they're infusing that spirit with, namely juniper, but it can be many dozens of other things. We've got gins with all sorts of different botanicals. Now, what Spirit Hound is doing up in Lyons, they actually have a bunch of their locals who are fans of their distillery who, while they're out hiking, pick juniper berries and bring them back for Craig to work into his gin basket. He's also purchasing spices and botanicals from all over the place and infusing them into his gin. What really makes this gin stand out, I'm sure you can probably pick up on, but I'm just going to tell you, is fennel. This
Ooh.
gin actually gives you a really nice little bit of a licorice character.
Okay.
Which is of course divisive. A lot of people try something with licorice in it and say, man, I hate that. But for me, I think it's a really nice note, and it's definitely very integrated.
I don't like licorice, but I like this smell
Yeah.
because it is like well melded in,
Yeah,
and it's not overwhelmingly licorice. It's not all I'm smelling.
right. And so gin as a category is a really interesting one, because back in the early days of gin production, the original way that they made it was actually inspired by the Dutch. The Dutch had this style called Genever, which was essentially not a neutral base, a white whiskey as a base, where it hasn't been distilled all the way up to 95% alcohol, but was instead distilled to about 50% alcohol, and then they infused it with juniper and other spices. With that 50% alcohol, that other 50% of what's in there when they infuse, that's all of those different flavors from whatever their base grain is. So it's going to taste a lot more grain forward and cereal notes. It's going to be sweeter. When it crossed the English Channel and the English tried it for the first time, they said, wow, that's really good, and juniper's really cheap. We could manufacture this, but it's kind of sweet, and we don't like that. It's kind of gross. So they ended up just distilling the ever-loving crap out of it to 95% alcohol by volume and created the style of dry gin, or London dry.
Okay.
And so that Genever is almost like a missing link of the original style. But these days, dry gins kind of run the gamut, and we're actually kind of circling back around and making things that aren't necessarily at a neutral point. This, however, is a neutral spirit base with all of those kinds of herbs and botanicals and all of that.
Does every gin have to have juniper?
Yes, that's a requirement to be a gin. And I think that at one point they did say that it has to be the main botanical note. But I think that that's really kind of difficult, kind of like the
Yeah.
flavor of vodka. It's hard to say, well, the main note in here is juniper. These days, and I would qualify this one as a new Western style of gin, where they've really dialed back the influence that juniper has, and they're instead bringing into the forefront all of the other botanicals and other notes that are going on. So it's not just like eating a juniper bush. It's got some spices, it's got that fennel, it's got some lemon to it, and it's a lot less punchy up front.
Okay.
Yeah. And it makes really excellent Negronis. Yeah, it's a go-to for me for the Negroni. Sweet. We should move on to whiskey.
I really like that gin.
It's good, right?
It's
Yeah.
really good.
So what we have in our glass right now is the Spirit Hound Straight Malt Whiskey. Malt whiskey is a word that you see written on a lot of labels, and these days there's actually a really big upswelling of support for a classification of American single malt whiskey, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But generally speaking, if it's made in the US and it says malt whiskey on it, then you know that it has to be a majority malted barley. Malt is just shortening of the term malted barley. And when I talk about malted barley, I'm talking about the same thing that you would make a beer from. Almost all of the beers that we have, with some very cheap and domestic exceptions, are made with 100% some kind of malted barley.
Yeah.
From there, you just make a beer, essentially, and chuck it into a still, and then distill off everything from it. After you distill off all the alcohol from your mash, is what you call that whole beer part of it, you throw it all into a barrel where it ages. And a lot of people argue that without barrel aging, you don't have whiskey at all. Earlier, when I was talking about Genever versus gin, we were talking about that white spirit being a white whiskey, right?
Yeah.
If you had thrown that Genever into a barrel instead of infusing it with juniper, you would end up with a barrel-aged whiskey, something very much like these whiskeys here. Being a malt whiskey means at least 51% malted barley, but in the United States, as we move forward with this new law, hopefully it'll get codified into a new style that is always 100% malted barley for American single malt. Now, this one is 100% malted barley, grown in Colorado, and it's aged in new and previously used American oak casks. I believe that they're using almost all new heavily charged. Yeah, actually, it says on the bottle, new oak casks. So, in order to put straight on your label, you must age it for a certain amount of time. It's at least 2 years. It's actually at least 4 years, but if it's at least 2, they can say somewhere on the label that is still straight whiskey and what the youngest component is.
Okay.
And I'm sorry if that got a little confusing, but straight whiskey, the most important part, in my opinion, is that if it says straight on the label, there's no added color, there's no added sugar. The only thing they're allowed to add is water to make it more drinkable. So it's a pretty unadulterated thing. Now, malt whiskey in general, as opposed to bourbon, which is made with mostly corn, you'll find drinks with a lot of cereal grains. And the barrel influence on this, because it's a straight whiskey with new casks, means that you'll really get a lot of oak notes from it. And those oak notes tend to be, especially with American oak, vanilla and caramel and a little bit of like a char and wood smoke note.
And what does it mean that it's single malt? Could you have a double malt?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, being a single malt whiskey doesn't actually have any designation here in the US yet, but they are working on that, and I believe Spirit Hound is actually on the petition to be signed to get that into codification for labels. But most often when you're talking about single malt whiskey, you're talking about single malt Scotch. And what that means in the EU, that whole designation of single malt Scotch is the product of one single distillery. It's still many dozens of barrels all blended together, but just product of a single distillery. And being a single malt versus double malt, I don't see anyone writing double malt on any of their labels. What they usually would say is something like blended malt Scotch, which is product of multiple distilleries blended together.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you think of this one?
Again, I drank bad alcohol in college.
Yeah, I went to college
it's
here.
good. This is really good. It kind of reminds me of like toasted like Honey Nut Cheerios. I'm definitely like caramely a little bit. Like I'm getting what you said about the cereal. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, this is really good.
I've always felt like Spirit Hound had a honey bunches of oats note to it, those clusters and that honey to it, and definitely got those cereal grain notes, and that American oak is in there, but it doesn't take over the whole thing. It's not like chewing on oak chips. It's very well balanced. So yeah, a local favorite, and they've been refining their malt whiskey for 12 years now. Yeah. All right, so this is Spirit Hound's coffee liqueur. And we were talking a little bit earlier about a liqueur. Some of the key things that you can look at on labels to help you figure out is what I'm drinking, a liquor or a liqueur, especially since sometimes they don't even say liqueur. They'll just say schnapp or whatever else, is what alcohol content it is. And I believe that the cafe is at, it's this front one. I think it's at 25, 20% alcohol or 40 proof. So your very general rule that you can follow is the lower in alcohol content it is, the higher in sugar it's going to be. Now, when you're drinking really cheap liquor, sugar covers a multitude of sins, right? That's why all of these very cheap vodkas that all the college kids are slamming down and everything like that, they're all very, very sweet. And that's because sugar covers over the poorer quality of their base spirit. When you're drinking a coffee liqueur like this, however, the sugar is there because coffee itself is pretty bitter. And they're trying to make something that's enjoyable and drinkable just on its own, on the rocks. It's got some dessert qualities to it. And it's the kind of thing that I personally would mix with some vanilla ice cream and some vodka and make like a little...
I definitely want this in my espresso martini.
Yeah, it makes an excellent espresso martini as well.
Smells so good.
Yeah. And coffee liqueur is kind of a growing category right now. A lot of people are saying, well, what is Kahlua anyways? It's just rum and coffee and sugar. And people are coming out with their own, with higher quality coffee or with coffee sourced from a certain area, and you coffee nuts out there know what I'm talking about. But yeah, this is a really excellent, on the mellow side, very sippable, not too bitter, but not too sweet either. It's quite balanced. And
Would you drink this on the rocks?
yes,
Yes.
I do drink it on the rocks. Yes, yeah. Got a bottle in my fridge. It's a nice after work shot. Yeah. But yeah, bitterness of the coffee is totally laid off by just a little bit of sugar in there, a couple of almost molasses notes.
That's really, really good.
Yeah, it's tasty stuff. Well, that was some of the basics of spirits and liquor. I want to thank Kelly Burke from Spirit Hound Distillery for supplying these spirits for us and having this ready to rock. And I'll leave it to Lily.
Ask your questions in the comments and come fly with us again soon.